It's an honor to be here. My name is Eugene Huff. Actually, I'm Executive Director and President of Saving Hallowed Ground. Saving Hallowed Ground is a 501c3 organization that was founded in 2012. The mission of Saving Hallowed Ground covers various aspects, but most importantly, in simple terms, to enter communities, to engage schools, students, and locals to learn about the history through conducting projects on their historic monuments and markers. The mission is a just one because every community has monuments and markers. We drive by the roads very quickly. Sometimes we lose track as to the importance of that. Thanks to the Doylestown Historical Society, which had reached out to Saving Hallowed Ground, they had learned that in recent years, actually 2 years ago, Saving Hallowed Ground was asked to become a national commemorative partner with the National World War I Centennial Commission in Washington, D.C. We were honored with that title, but we also inform people that we cover all time periods. So though we are very supportive of World War I history and the projects here in Doylestown, we're interested in Hatboro, Horsham, Philadelphia as well to engage students, and hopefully by you experiencing this talk today and make sure we get your business cards, we can form a partnership, and that's what this program is all about. Saving Hallowed Ground is very fortunate to receive financial support from the Uncommon Individual Foundation, and we are based in Devon. But again, Saving Hallowed Ground is a separate entity, and we believe it's extremely important that wherever we go, we form partnerships. Speaking after me briefly is a fellow board member, Barry Johnson, who is one of the head committees members for the Pennsylvania World War I Centennial, which is equally important that we share Pennsylvania stories. And following that will be Dr. John Marks, who is a project coordinator, program coordinator with Saving Hallowed Ground, and has been instrumental in working forward, particularly as we reach out to form alliances with schools and communities, because you always have to do follow-ups. And we go to, as yesterday, we were in Ocean County, New Jersey, and we met historians and teachers and other people, lots of business cards. But you have to follow up and you have to keep track of these people because their story is very important. So we are committed to Doylestown for the centennial. We will continue to be here beyond the centennial, but we want to also network on other levels as well. Barry, if you would please come up and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Barry Johnson. I'm with the Pennsylvania World War I Centennial Committee. As you probably know, this is the 100th anniversary of the First World War, 1914 to 1918. And in 2013, Congress created the United States World War I Centennial Commission to serve as a lead organization for commemorating the American involvement in the First World War, which didn't begin until 1917 as a belligerent. The commission hosts websites and served as the intake for volunteers for the 50 states. They recognized they couldn't do everything from Washington, D.C., so the people from the 50 states have all been enlisted, you might say. I'm one of those. There are 8 of us in Pennsylvania, and we have a website called Pennsylvania in the First World War, and Pennsylvania was in fact a big deal in the First World War. In the 1910 census, Pennsylvania was ranked 2nd in population, just after New York. The U.S. population was much more concentrated in the East 100 years ago. Pennsylvania was the number 2 state in population, and the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh industrial districts played a critical role in the American war effort and also as the arsenal for the Western Allies and for Russia. So Pennsylvania was important, and our work is to document and honor those who served and to give meaning to the events of 100 years ago that really profoundly affected the United States. It's really, the First World War was really the birth of the modern American nation, when the United States as a whole country responded to a national emergency, and the American nation we know today really began with the First World War. It's a somewhat forgotten era, uh, partly because it was followed so soon by an even worse catastrophe, the Second World War. But you probably know that in the First World War, American women could not vote. But American women were killed, wounded, and decorated for heroism in the First World War, and in 1920 got universal suffrage. Some of the states did have women voting, but the United States as a whole did not. So that's one outcome from the First World War that continues today. Also, it was the beginning of what's called the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the rest of the country to fill in the absence, the shortage of labor during World War I. And African Americans moved out of the old Confederacy to the rest of the country. And that's another persistent outcome of the First World War. So it was really quite a watershed in our history. And we're here to honor a generation and its era that are largely forgotten. So should you have any pictures of grandfathers, grandmothers, great uncles, great aunts who served during that era, we'd like to put them on the Pennsylvania website. And I'll be around and I'll give you the address for it. And if you would send those to me, we'd like to include them. The website is hosted by the United States World War I Centennial Commission. And the contents of the Pennsylvania and the other websites will be permanently archived in the National Archives. So if you give it to me, it'll go permanently in the National Archives. So that's all I have to say. And now, Stu, do you want to introduce John Marks?
Again, I'm very proud to introduce Dr. John Marks, my colleague. And I just want to share with you that we had reached out to Doylestown regarding one of our program, which is the traveling 20 by 30 foot flag in recognition of the veterans and individuals who lived during the time period. And we are trying to bring that to different YMCA locations. In Berwyn, when I was going to the Y, I noticed on the wall these wonderful posters from World War I indicating the role of the YMCA in World War I. And I approached John. I said, wow, what a great topic to cover on the story of the YMCA. And so he was gracious enough to do this presentation. But before just closing out, though, I will be following up after John. Following the overall ceremony, we will ask you for 10 minutes to come outside. You will be issued white gloves, and we will unveil and fold the 20 by 30 foot flag, which is going to be traveling across the country and hopefully overseas. So you are part of history today. Thank you. John?
Yeah, thank you, Gene. It's been almost a year now since I finished my Ph.D., and being introduced as Dr. John Marks is still gives me a kick, so that's always fun, so thank you for that. I wanted to say briefly thank you to the folks at the Doylestown Historical Society. As a historian, I've had interactions with folks from a number of different state and local historical societies, and they are not all nearly as organized and as active and as good as the folks at the Doylestown Historical Society, so you guys should be very proud to have them in your community. And likewise, thank you to everyone at the Doylestown Bookshop. I am honored to be speaking here on Independent Bookstore Day, so that is very exciting for me. I think these kinds of events are really the best of what local independent bookshops have to offer, so if you can give a little extra support to the bookshop today, I'm sure that they would appreciate it on this most special of holidays. But as Gene mentioned, I started looking into this topic, thinking about the links between the YMCA and World War I when we started doing some programs with the YMCA closer to our office out on the main line. And I was immediately captured by how deep these ties went, the extent of the YMCA's activities during the World War I era. And I feel like this is part of a history that maybe we don't understand, and certainly a history of the YMCA that maybe most people don't really tend to think about. So first, I wanted to ask everyone what they tend to think of when they think about the YMCA. Certainly for most people, World War I is not the first thing that comes to mind when they think of the Y. So what's that? The Village People? Yeah, I'd say that's pretty high at the top of the list for most. For me, thinking about the YMCA still, after years of swimming competitively and working as a lifeguard, thinking about the YMCA still fills me with a little bit of dread after going there for not the most fun reasons over many years when I was younger. Most people think of it as a community center, think of exercise classes, think of swimming lessons, all of these types of things. But the YMCA still has a much broader social mission. It is still the Young Men's Christian Association, and it is dedicated to a variety of youth advocacy issues. They try to promote youth leadership, they try to create opportunities for youth development, and yes, they try to promote the physical well-being of young people as well. But the history of the YMCA and the way that it developed stretches back into the early 19th century, and that's where I want to start today. So I'm a historian of the 18th and 19th century, so we'll maybe be spending a little bit more time in that era than you might have expected for a World War I talk, but to me, I think it's crucial for understanding what the YMCA does in the 20th century. In order to understand that, we need to start in the 19th century. Specifically, we need to start with the industrial and market revolutions. Without getting too lost in the weeds, the industrial and market revolutions emerge over the first half of the 19th century and really fundamentally transform the lives of most people in Europe, the lives of most people in the United States. The advent of coal power and of steam power, along with massive changes in manufacturing processes, labor organization, transportation, communication, all of these things fundamentally transform people's lives during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Prior to these revolutions, most people in, say, England or the United States were raised and lived and worked in rural countrysides. The Industrial and Market Revolution changed significantly how people lived and worked. So during the first half of the 19th century, the very notion of going to work emerges for the first time, right? That rather than sort of a much more subsistence living model, people for the first time during the early 19th century are going to a centralized location, working with other people in exchange for a wage. And this leads thousands and thousands, perhaps millions of people into urban centers for the first time. People are moving from the rural countryside into cities for the first time during the first half of the 19th century, and they are working in these new models that emerge because of the industrial and market revolutions. So this is particularly true for young people who are leaving the sort of safety and guidance and supervision of their families and their immediate communities for the first time, moving to places like London and New York, seeking job opportunities and working in exchange for a cash wage. And with that cash wage and urban life comes ways to spend cash in cities. And these are things that emerged that were very troublesome and troubling for both Americans and Europeans during the 19th century. That you have the rise of taverns, of brothels, of gambling dens, and a host of other vices that were available to people for the first time as they moved into these urban centers. So the first image I'm going to show you, and there'll be a number of them today, this is an image of early 19th century New York, and begins to give you a sense of the kind of urban bustle that is emerging because of the industrial and market revolutions. Likewise, this is an image of England, of people going to work in the factory outside of London or in London, and you can see women and children, in addition to adult men, going to work for the first time. And this is the kinds of changes that are happening during the first half of the 19th century. And because of these fundamental changes in labor organization and in people's lives, right? You're not living near a small number of people in your immediate community. You're not necessarily living near your family anymore. That people in the United States particularly begin to worry what this means for our national character, what this means for morality, what this means for the individual if they are living away from community and family, if all of these changes are taking place so rapidly, if all of these vices and temptations are becoming available to people, especially to young people, what this means for the United States. And the response both in Western Europe and the United States was a broad age of reform. So people responded to these transformations with a reform movements of a wide variety of kinds. So on the one hand, you have thousands and thousands of people who are flocking to religion for the first time. During the first half of the 19th century that Methodists and Baptists become the most prominent religions in the United States. You have people attending these massive revival meetings during the 19th century, thinking about questions about morality and character. You have the temperance movement take off in the 19th century, trying to encourage people to abstain from alcohol. It's almost mind-boggling how much alcohol Americans were drinking during the first half of the 19th century, and not something that we tend to appreciate. And the temperance movement did have an impact. Abolitionism, the anti-slavery movement, also begins in earnest during the 19th century, and dozens of other kinds of social reform movements begin in response to these changes that are unleashed by the industrial and market revolutions. So here you can see this is a camp meeting, a religious revival of Methodists in upstate New York. Upstate New York is one of the places in particular that at one time was all a rural countryside, and the advent of canals means it is connected to the wider world in a way that it simply was not 50 years prior. You have urban centers that are popping up around these canals that are really fundamentally changing the lives of people in New York. So that's why it was one of the sites most popular for these kinds of religious revivals. I'm not sure how many of you have been to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. It's an incredible site for those of you who haven't been there, but this is emerges during this age of reform, right? Rather than simply saying we want to, that criminals, people who break the law, are going to be punished with corporal punishment or fines or banishment, that there's an opportunity to reform the criminal and reintroduce them to society. And Eastern State Penitentiary is a prime example of this new type of prison and part of this broader age of reform. I live around here, and it does not look like that anymore, I can assure you. Likewise, the temperance movement is perhaps the most notable of these, of the age of reform, of these social movements, and this is one of their many broadsides and flyers, and are some of my favorite 19th century printed materials. Here you can see, for those of you who can't read it at the bottom, it says the drunkard's progress, and it shows you the very rapid decline from just a single drink unto his death because of this drinking problem during the 19th century. And this is what part of this broader age of reform as well. And I set it up this way, and I promise I will get to the topic at hand, but I think it's important to understand the broader social and cultural world in which the YMCA emerges for the first time. And it is founded in 1844 as part of this broader age of reform. So it is founded in London by a man named George Williams in 1844. Williams himself was born in the rural countryside and moved to London as a young man, and is one of many people who is troubled by the changes that are happening to young people, changes that are happening to individuals' lives in London during the first half of the 19th century. So George Williams says that he wants to, quote, to provide a safe Christian environment for rural young men and women journeying to the cities. So the YMCA emerges not just as a place to offer swim lessons, but as a place that can offer these people moving to the cities for the first time an outlet and an opportunity to remain tied to strong Christian morals, to have wholesome opportunities for entertainment, for recreation, for social interaction outside of the dens of iniquity, as it were, that were emerging in these urban centers during the 19th century. And it's connected to this broader age of reform. In the United States, likewise, just a couple years after the founding of the first YMCA in London, you have the founding of the first United States chapter in Boston in 1851, and was specifically directed at trying to offer an outlet to sailors, merchants, other people that were living in and moving to this rapidly expanding urban center in the Northeast. In 1853, just 2 years later, a man named Anthony Bowen, formerly held in slavery, had gained his freedom by 1853 and founded the first YMCA for African Americans in Washington, D.C. And by 1861, the YMCA begins its first foray into providing services for the military. And I think that this is a really crucial moment for the history of the YMCA, especially as we think about its history during the World War I era. That during the Civil War, you have an unprecedented, almost unfathomable level of death and dying that the United States struggled, and people in the United States really struggled to deal with. That how do we handle this massive humanitarian issue? And the YMCA steps up for the first time to try to offer assistance to the United States. So beginning in 1861, about 5,000 volunteers volunteer for the United States Christian Commission, promoted by the YMCA. You have YMCA volunteers who during the Civil War serve as nurses, as surgeons, as chaplains, and in a wide variety of other roles, trying to help manage this level of death and dying and violence that was unprecedented in American history. And this really offers the blueprint for the kinds of work that the YMCA does during the First World War. So after the experience of serving in the Civil War and in the Spanish-American War, perhaps the only American war that we think about less than World War I, the YMCA really took the lead during the Great War on providing welfare work for these soldiers. Now, this welfare work encompasses a wide variety of items. That it includes providing recreation, religious services to soldiers, provides food, stationary, providing an outlet for soldiers on the front lines and soldiers in training to have some kind of rest and some kind of reprieve from the horrors and the drag of war. YMCA volunteers really tried to provide both for the body and mind and spirit of soldiers who were fighting during the First World War, that they provided them religious instruction while also trying to keep them healthy and happy in a variety of other ways. And it's important to remember that these were not things that the United States military or the United States government provided in 1914. That today we think of all of these services, we think of R&R, we think of the USO, and none of these things existed as part of the American military in 1914 at the advent of the Great War. That's the YMCA was one of the only entities providing this kind of service to American soldiers. In fact, they performed about 90% of all of the welfare work, broadly speaking, during the Great War. So as I mentioned, they provided entertainment, recreation, spiritual services, food, quite importantly, leisure activities, education, supplies. They raised funds, and they did a wide variety of other work. And through this work, tried to provide for the mind, body, and spirit of the soldiers. One of the most interesting things to me as I began engaging in this project was that the involvement of the YMCA really represents a part of the American involvement in the war prior to the formal declaration of war in 1917. So even though American soldiers weren't involved beginning in 1914, the American YMCA, as part of this broader international movement, the American YMCA was involved almost from the very beginning. So in cooperation with partners in Great Britain and elsewhere around the world, the American YMCA trained secretaries to assist the efforts by the British YMCA to provide for British soldiers. They provided, and crucially, this was one of the major things they did in the first couple years of the war, they provided spiritual and welfare services to prisoners of war on both sides. So they provided for Allied soldiers who were being held in prisoner of war camps, and they also provided for the prisoners from the Central Powers that were being held in British camps during these first 3 years of the war. They served millions and millions of soldiers and sailors prior to the U.S. formally becoming involved in the Great War, and I found that to be interesting. A way that, aside from the economic relationships and trade relationships and those types of support, that there was this very real connection between Americans and the Great War prior to 1917. But as you might expect, once the United States does formally declare war in April of 1917, the YMCA becomes much more involved in the war effort. So as soldiers began to prepare to deploy to Western Europe, the YMCA was there to provide for them at these bases, at these training camps. On the left here, you can see this is at a YMCA in Kansas, just outside an Army training facility, sometime either in late 1916 or early 1917. Likewise, at a camp in McAllen, Texas, you can see soldiers here playing basketball. This was the other thing that I spent a day going down the rabbit hole about, that basketball is invented in the 1890s at the YMCA, actually the International YMCA College in Springfield, Massachusetts, where today the Basketball Hall of Fame is. It is invented at a YMCA, and this is just 20 years after it had been invented, that you have basketball being promoted around the world because of the work the YMCA is doing during the Great War. So these are soldiers that are playing basketball at a YMCA facility in McAllen in Texas, and you can see the big YMCA letters on the building. This is at another YMCA in Pharr, Texas, outside an Army training facility. And this picture, to me, I think, encompasses the kind of work that the YMCA was trying to do at home, even before soldiers deployed to Western Europe. So you can see soldiers writing letters, reading magazines, playing checkers. Another man is playing a piano, and you could see people around him singing. But on the wall is a massive banner that you cannot miss, that says, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain." So they're providing for the kind of immediate needs of these soldiers, offering them a break from this rigorous training by providing them kinds of recreation opportunities, entertainment, magazines, games, books, things of that nature, while also trying to make sure that they are paying attention to their spiritual needs as well, making sure that they are remaining tied to these strong Christian foundations. Again, you have more pictures, and as a historian of the 18th and 19th century, I was kind of overwhelmed by the wealth of photographs and images from this era. I'm not used to having quite such a rich document source and a rich imagery that I can draw upon. Usually I'm up here showing pictures of pieces of paper with illegible handwriting on them, so this was a treat for me as well. But this is the kind of experience that you had of soldiers with the YMCA prior to their deployment to Western Europe and elsewhere throughout the world. But not only did they provide these services to soldiers who were getting ready to deploy, they also trained a wide variety of workers who would go with American soldiers to Western Europe and would provide services for them over there. And this included things like nurses, secretaries, and chaplains in particular. So at the International YMCA College in Springfield, Massachusetts, they trained what they called war workers. And this is the first graduating class of war workers in 1917. And these are two of the flyers that began to be posted all around the country, describing the kinds of work that the YMCA College could train people to do, and they were asking for people who were not subject to the draft to volunteer to be trained in this way so that they could go and assist the war effort in a way aside from being a soldier. You have them, describing the kinds of work as secretaries, as chaplains, as surgeons, as nurses, and a wide variety of other work that they the YMCA began to get experience doing during the Civil War. They became the experts on it during the Spanish-American War, and they were able to train thousands of war workers during the first years of American involvement in the war that they could then send over with American troops to Western Europe. And the red triangle really is the symbol of the YMCA. For years was the symbol of the YMCA, and is just part of the imagery of the World War I era that to me became inescapable. Once I realized how involved the YMCA was, everywhere I looked in World War I documents, you see this red triangle. And to me, the YMCA and understanding its role during the war is essential for understanding soldiers' everyday experiences over the course of the Great War. Here they're describing emergency work that they offered in 1918. So they're not just doing the same kind of thing, they're actually responding to changes that are occurring over the course of the war. One thing that was happening is that boys, children, were being forced into work for many of them were being forced into work for the first time or in a larger role because so many adult men were off fighting the war. So they're trying to train people who can then lead and manage these child workers in factories. They are responding to the agricultural needs that are being massively impacted by the war. So I think it's interesting that these courses weren't just the same, even though it's only a couple of years that the United States is actively involved. They change to changing conditions. One of the other major initiatives of the YMCA over the course of the war at home, the things that they did in the United States, was trying to raise funds for their activities in Western Europe. And this is a very typical flyer poster that they began circulating during the Great War, and it's asking Americans to help us help our boys, including the YMCA and YWCA. Likewise, they called on they called on Woodrow Wilson, who offered endorsements of the YMCA and their work. And in the image on the right, you can see that they call the YMCA the last evidence that anybody cares. And they encourage people to donate to the YMCA to show our boys over there that the people who are at home are still thinking about them, are still concerned about them, and are still looking for ways to support them as they fight this war. But the YMCA didn't just do work at home. They did their perhaps most important work at the front and in Western Europe. So they trained these workers at college, at the YMCA college, who they then sent over to provide religious service, entertainment, food, shelter, recreation, stationery, and a wide variety of other things. The YMCA sent over 26,000 paid staff members, in addition to 35,000 volunteers and almost 1,500 entertainers. They operated 26 large R&R centers, which was not something that existed prior to World War I. 26 R&R centers in France and 4,000 huts. And these huts become the image of the YMCA in Europe during the Great War. That every soldier, American soldier, British soldier, looked forward to spending time in one of these YMCA huts. They also operated 1,500 canteens, and the YMCA supported, and this was kind of baffling to me, 44 European cookie and candy factories. 44 cookie and candy factories to provide sweets to soldiers who were fighting in World War I. And it's just we think now, sending care packages over is something that's just kind of a part of American life and part of the zeitgeist, and that's not something that existed during the Great War. So the YMCA made sure that it did exist by supporting these candy factories and cookie factories to be able to provide goods to the soldiers. And they promoted their efforts to continue to try to raise funds. And this image on the left was the title of my talk, and to me was the most kind of abiding image of all of these that I looked at over the course of my research, calling the YMCA his home over there. Right, that this is an opportunity for these American soldiers, for these British soldiers fighting throughout Western Europe and elsewhere, to have a little piece of home while they are engaged in fighting this war. On the right, you have General Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, endorsing the work of the YMCA and talking about how enthusiastic he is about the work that they're doing and how essential it is to the lives of the soldiers who are fighting. Likewise, former President William Howard Taft said during the course of the Great War that we should feel proud of the YMCA work, which is directed so ably, giving our men the nearest thing they can get to a Christian home on the firing line. Likewise, he said that the American YMCA in its welfare work served between 4 and 5 million of American soldiers and sailors at home and overseas. As General Pershing has said, it has conducted 9/10 of the welfare work among the American forces in Europe. So it's hard to undersell how important the work the YMCA was doing and how essential that work was to the experience of soldiers fighting in World War I. So this is in Belgium. This is in a YMCA hut in the kitchen, and these are American soldiers preparing food. This is a kind of very typical, and there are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of these kinds of photographs. But this is a very typical YMCA hut. This one is either in France or Flanders, and these are soldiers that are grouped outside of it. And this is what the inside of one of these huts would look like. And you can see all of these soldiers arranged at writing desks, likely writing letters home. And this is one of the primary things that these YMCAs are providing to soldiers is, an opportunity to write letters home, and also the stationery and pens and things to mail it with, and the service, the post office, to actually get make sure that the letters get sent to the proper people. Here you can see these women volunteers with the YMCA serving food to soldiers. One of the things that you hear frequently in soldiers' diaries is how bad the food is, if they have food at all. So this is one of the things that the YMCA is able to provide, is providing this kind of a hot meal, something that they recognize maybe from home, providing those to the soldiers. Likewise, this is another YMCA in France, and you can really see how the YMCA responds to the resources and the environment that's available. That this YMCA looks very different than the YMCA hut that we just looked at, and it depends on where they are and what materials are available and what they could do to make them available to the soldiers. Elsewhere in France, basketball is continue its spread around the globe, and this is beginning to look like the basketball that we recognize, not played outside on a dirt field, but played inside at this officers' club at a YMCA in France. The YMCA continues to be concerned with the physical well-being of soldiers. This is a YMCA worker at a hospital in Poland training soldiers who are recovering in how to complete these different leg exercises. Training them in calisthenics and things like that. Likewise, in Great Britain, you have another YMCA facility, and you have soldiers taking a break, taking a rest, playing some kind of ball game. But perhaps the image that comes to mind first of World War I is, of course, of trench warfare. Is not of people having experience, an R&R experience at a place like this, but is, in fact, being near the trenches. And the YMCA was there too, and they responded to those conditions as well. That these are YMCA huts that were at the front along the trenches, built in and still providing these kinds of services to soldiers fighting during World War I, even in the most dangerous of places. And these to me were were just mind-blowing, and I really like these images of the YMCA working, not just offering these services, not just offering assistance and entertainment to soldiers 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away, but being right there in the trenches with them to be able to improve their lives just a little bit. Unless you think that all of the YMCA's activities were in France, that is not the case. This is, in the top left, a YMCA canteen in Alexandria, Egypt. Next to that are camels transporting YMCA equipment across the Libyan desert. On the bottom, you have 2 YMCA dugouts in Palestine and Gaza. So the YMCA really did try to get everywhere they could to be able to provide these services to soldiers, and helps us get a sense of how widespread this affair, this war actually was, that it was indeed taking place all over the world, and that meant that the YMCA also had to be all over the world. The image of camels transporting this equipment across the desert was one that that really kind of, it sunk in for me how much work the YMCA was doing and the lengths that they had to go to make sure that these services were provided to soldiers. Likewise, this is the exterior and interior of another YMCA canteen, this one outside of Cairo, Egypt. It's hard to see, but one of the signs in there says post office, so that even there they could, that soldiers could send letters back home. But not only were they providing food and entertainment, or food and religious services, they were providing entertainment to the soldiers. So this is a songbook produced and published by the YMCA that soldiers could obtain at these YMCA huts that would offer them songs to sing, to share, would offer a form of entertainment. On the right is a postcard provided by the YMCA that allows soldiers to write home, but also promotes the work that the YMCA is doing, explains the different types of services that they're offering. This is an image where you have all these recovering soldiers at a hospital reading magazines. So that's one of the other things that the YMCA really focused on doing, was distributing this sort of literature and reading material, entertainment for the soldiers. This next image is one that was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Western Europe, and it's all filled with magazines and songbooks and literature for these prisoners of war to read. And this really hit home for me, thinking about this massive humanitarian effort that the YMCA is engaging in with no funding or direct assistance from any of these governments, that this is strictly a charitable endeavor. And I want to close with this image, and it's a quote from General Pershing, and he says, "The YMCA welcomes the soldier. It gives him the opportunity of improving himself physically, mentally, and morally. Strong muscles, clear brains, high ideals in the soldier increase the fighting efficiency of the soldier." And to me, this speaks directly to the legacy of the YMCA and the work that they did during World War I. Because in the years after World War I, as the YMCA provides this variety of services to soldiers both in the United States and in Western Europe, much of that work becomes institutionalized and formalized within the military. So because the military is able to see how essential this kind of work was, because the YMCA provided it, you have this sort of welfare work that's being formalized and becomes part of what the military offers and part of what they see as essential to offer to soldiers in order to carry out the mission. That rest and relaxation, for example, recreation, entertainment, spiritual services especially, aren't seen as tangential to the war effort, but are after what the YMCA does during World War I, these things become to be seen as essential. So the YMCA continues to offer this work in future conflicts, but to some extent, some of their services are institutionalized by the military. Other organizations emerge to replace the YMCA, perhaps most notably the USO, in providing this direct entertainment to soldiers overseas. And I think that understanding this role of the YMCA, this massive impact they had on the experiences of soldier, is really essential for understanding the lives of soldiers during the Great War, and to me is essential for understanding the contours of the Great War itself. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you very much for being here.